About a year ago now, I put up my first dedicated aircraft overview. That was on the Albatros D.III, the workhorse of the Imperial German air campaign. In that video, I also briefly touched on the Austro-Hungarian model of the D.III. This is an important topic because by all accounts, the Austrians took a good, but not great, plane and turned it into one of the best of the war. So great were the improvements that the Austrians kept this plane in service until the end of the war. And while the Eastern Front was an easier theater to operate in, that still says something. As does the fact that the Austrian D.III is one of very few mid-Great War fighters to serve into the interwar period. Now, as I have already covered the D.III itself, I will link that video in the description, and largely focus on the Austro-Hungarian model for this one, although I will make some comparisons here and there. Let's get into it. One of the first things to keep in mind here is that the Austro-Hungarian air service was never particularly large or well equipped. It wasn't small or anything like that, but the Austrians often found themselves outnumbered, especially in the late war. Domestic design couldn't really keep up with the needs of the service, which is where Albatros comes in. In fact, the Austrians would build two Albatros models, a handful of the D2, and then the D3. The latter, as the topic of this video, is the relevant one. During the fall of 1916, while the Germans were still ramping up their own production line, the Austrians requested a production license for the D3. This was granted, and the Austrians set about building the aircraft. Not without certain changes, however. When the first German aircraft reached the front line, in December of 1916, issues almost immediately cropped up. By late January, this became a serious enough problem that the planes were grounded pending investigation. What was this issue, you may be asking? Well, it was nothing major. Just lower wings cracking, snapping, and even, in some cases, outright failing. No big deal. Right, joking aside, this was a real issue. An issue that the Germans never quite fixed in their own design, although they did patch it, mostly through more intensive quality control and reinforcing the lower wing, along with the wing struts themselves. The general belief at the time was that quality control issues were to blame, rushed production and other such things contributing to poor build quality. Certainly feasible, although it could also be a design fault. The French Nieuport planes, which directly inspired the D.III, suffered similar issues. It might well have been a flaw in sesquiplane design. Those are planes where the lower wing was smaller than the upper wing, for those curious. In any event, there are a couple potential options for this design flaw. For example, the main spar was too far back. This caused unwanted twisting in flight, which put a lot of stress on the wings and the spars. Something made worse by an issue with the bolts securing the spar to the lower wing. These had a tendency to work loose during service. They would even elongate, which is very much not a good thing. Things like that are why the German planes never quite lost their wing issues, although the patch job did at least keep them in service. While this was going on, the Austro-Hungarian factory was presumably watching closely. Austrian planes only began to enter service in May of 1917. That was plenty of time for tinkering with the design to respond to issues in German service. While there were other changes made to the design, the big thing was fixing the wings. Austrian engineers strengthened the wings and supporting structure. This consisted of heavier ribs, reinforced spars, and various metal fittings, both to the spars themselves as well as the wings. These changes, put together, largely fixed the problem. From what I've read, the Austro-Hungarian D.3s never suffered the same wing cracking issue. Or, if they did, it was so minor that it doesn't really get brought up. This is actually really, really important. If a pilot doesn't have to worry about snapping their wing off, they'll pull moves they wouldn't otherwise do. In the dogfighting of the Great War, that was incredibly important. So, with the redesigned wings, where does that leave the Austrian planes? As I mentioned, production kicked into gear in mid-1917. In the end, the Austrians built their D.3s in several lots, specifically 3 different models, or at least 3 major models, with the usual minor tweaks during production. These were the Series 53, Series 153, and Series 253. The major difference between the 3 models was the engine. All 3 models used Austro-Daimler 6-cylinder engines, which were more powerful than the German D.III engine. With each successive model, the Austrians improved the horsepower further. On the Series 53 planes, this was a 185 horsepower inline engine. The 153 model swapped to a 200 horsepower engine, while the final 253 model used a 225 horsepower engine. With this more powerful engine, the Austro-Hungarian planes were better climbers, and also slightly faster than their German counterparts. It isn't a massive improvement, but it was more than enough to keep these planes in production. In fact, the Austrians never swapped to the D.5, preferring to continue building their improved D.III. In fairness, against the opposition in the East, this was more than enough. That aside, there were a couple other changes made during the Austro-Hungarian production. In the swap to the Series 153, the Austrians removed the propeller spinner from their aircraft. This, evidently, had a tendency to fall off during flight. The 153 birds also saw the introduction of a new, more rounded nose design. It is quite easy to differentiate Austrian and German planes by this redesign. However, to round this off, there was one area where the German planes were notably superior. Austrian aircraft used the Schwarzlose machine gun, 2 of them to be precise. This weapon, evidently, had serious reliability issues, especially with the synchronization gear. The Austrians eventually worked out most of the kinks, but it was a problem in service. With that out of the way, however, I'll put up a quick slide detailing the performance of the Series 253. These figures can be taken as broadly equivalent to German D.3s, with the major difference coming in top speed. Austrian planes could make 188 kilometers per hour or 117 miles per hour. The German D.3, for sake of comparison, had a top speed of around 175 kilometers per hour or 109 miles per hour. As for production numbers, there were 45 Series 53 planes built. Production shifted fairly quickly to the improved Series 153. Of these, 111 were initially ordered, although this was quickly increased to 281. By early 1918, the third and final model was developed, the Series 253, with its improved engine. 260 of these were ordered in May 1918, but only about 200 were completed, leading to a grand total of 527 aircraft, although some sources up this number to 586. With these statistics out of the way then, let's talk service. Unfortunately, there's not a lot written on this topic. This is true about the Austro-Hungarian war effort in general, but it's certainly an issue with the aviation side of things. The D.3s entered service in mid-1917. By this point of the war, the main enemy would have been on the Italian front. The Russians were soon to bow out, and Romania, such as they had in air service, was also out. Instead, the Austrian D.3s would largely face Western aviators, Italian, French, and British, and in one of the harshest environments possible, in common with the ground campaign. The Alps were not kind to either the men on the ground or the pilots in the air. The Austrians fit their planes with a winter cowling to help matters, but that could only do so much. In any event, by the time the D.3s entered service, they were on the losing side of the war. The Austrians built the planes as fast as they could, but they never had substantial numbers on the front line. At times, as few as 24 Austrian planes faced hundreds of Allied aircraft. This is not to say the D.3s were useless. It was partially down to the Italian front seeing older aircraft in general, but the Austrian planes remained competitive to the end of the war. The improvements in comparison to German design kept the D.3 in action long after it became obsolescent on the Western Front. Nonetheless, it could not save the Austrian war effort. This collapsed in 1918, and the story of the D.3 almost came to an end. Except not quite. The newly independent Polish Republic found itself at war with the Soviet Union. With a sudden and pressing need for whatever weapons they could get, the Poles acquired 38 of the final Series 253 production run. In fact, they came straight from the factory. These were eventually joined by another 10, rebuilt from various spare parts and leftover aircraft. At the time, the Soviet Air Force was distinctly lacking, so the Polish planes were mostly used for ground attack. This was during the Polish-Soviet War from 1919 through 1920. As an interesting note, the Poles also grabbed about 25 German D.3s. Those were retired in 1919 during the war because of the lingering wing issue. The Austrian planes, however, endured until 1923, quite a long time, considering it was fundamentally a mid-1916 design. The Czechoslovakians also operated a handful of ex-Austrian D.3s, although there is little information on how many or what they were used for. I said this in the previous D.3 video, and I'll say it again here. It's one of those funny historical notes. A German aircraft design that was improved by the Austrians, ending service in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.